Welcome back to another Following the Breadcrumbs with Charlie. Project Stormfury. I'll have to edit my thing. I've got it as Story Fury. So it won't be when you see this. Stormfury, the title. I missed that there, but I will fix that. Okay, actually I'm gonna do it now before Storm. That should be M. And there is my title. Okay. Project Stormfury. What is it? So here is, of course, our Wikipedia because they want us to know these things. They share them openly. The Project Stormfury was an attempt to weaken tropical cyclones by flying aircraft into them and seeding with silver iodide. The project was run by the United States government from 1962 to 1983. The hypothesis was that silver iodide would cause a supercooled water in the storm to freeze, disrupting the inner structure of the hurricane and thus leading to and this led to seeding several Atlantic hurricanes. However, it was later shown that this hypothesis was incorrect. It was determined that most hurricanes do not contain enough supercooled water for cloud seeding to be effective. Additionally, researchers found that unseeded hurricanes often undergo the same structural changes that were expected from seeded hurricanes. And this finding caused Stormfury's successes into question, as the changes reported now had a natural explanation. The last experimental flight was flown in 1971 due to a lack of candidate storms and a changeover in NOAA's fleet. Project Stormfury was officially canceled more than a decade after the last modification experiment. Although the project failed to achieve its goal of reducing the destructiveness of hurricanes, its observational data and storm life cycle research helped to improve meteorologists' ability to forecast the movement and intensity of hurricanes. Its hypothesis: cloud seeding was first attempted by Vincent Schaefer and Irving Langmuir. After witnessing the artificial creation of ice crystals, Langmuir became an enthusiastic proponent of weather modification. Schaefer found that when he dumped crushed dried ice into a cloud, precipitation in the form of snow resulted. With regards to hurricanes, it was hypothesized that by seeding the area around the eye wall with silver oxide, latent heat would be released. This would promote the formation of a new eye wall. As this new eye wall was larger than the old eye wall, the winds of the tropical cyclone would be weaker due to a reduced pressure gradient. Even a small reduction in the speed of the hurricane's winds would be beneficial, since the damage potential of the hurricane increased as the square of the wind speed. A slight lowering of wind speed would have a large reduction on destructiveness. Due to Langmuir's efforts and the research of Schaefer at General Electric, the concept of using cloud seeding to weaken hurricanes gathered momentum. Indeed, Schaefer had caused a major snowstorm on December 20th of 1946 by seeding a cloud. This caused GE to drop out for legal reasons. Schaefer and Langmuir assisted the U.S. military as advisors for Project Cirrus, the first large study of cloud physics and weather modification. Its most important goal was to try to weaken hurricanes. So what is Project Cirrus? Project Cirrus was the first attempt to modify a hurricane. It was a collaboration of the General Electric Corporation, the United States Army Signal Corps, and the Office of Naval Research, and the U.S. Air Force. After several preparations and initial skepticism by government scientists, the first attempt to modify a hurricane began on October 13th of 1947 in a hurricane that was heading west to east out of sea. The Projects 2 B-17 and a B-29 of the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Group was dispatched from MacDill Field, Florida, to intercept the hurricane. The seeding B-17 flew along the rain bands of the hurricane and dropped nearly 180 pounds or 82 kilograms of crushed dried ice into the clouds. The crew reported, quote, pronounced modification of the cloud deck seeded. It is not known if that was due to the seeding. Next, the hurricane changed directions and made landfall near Savannah, Georgia. The public blamed the seeding, and Irvin Langmuir claimed that the reversal had been caused by human intervention. Cirrus was canceled and lawsuits were threatened. Only the fact that a system in 1906 had taken a similar path, as well as evidence showing that the storm had already begun to turn when the seeding began, ended the litigation. This disaster set back the cause of seeding hurricanes for 11 years. And at first, the seeding was officially denied, and it took years before the government admitted it. No shock there. According to the September 12, 1965 edition of the Fort Lauderdale News and Sun Sentinel, in 1947, a hurricane, quote, went wacky, and, quote, 12 years later, it was admitted the storm had in fact been seeded. Between the projects, the United States Weather Bureau's National Hurricane Research Project, founded in 1955, had as one of its objectives to investigate the scientific validity of hurricane modification methods. To this end, silver iodide dispensers were tested in Hurricane Daisy in October of 1958. The flares were deployed outside of the hurricane eye wall, so this was an equipment test rather than a modification experiment. The equipment malfunctioned in all but one of the flights, and no conclusive data was acquired. The first seeding experiment since Cirrus's disaster was attempted on September 16th of 1961 into Hurricane Esther by NHRP and the United States Navy aircraft. 8 cylinders of silver iodide were dropped into Esther's eye wall, and winds were recorded as weakening by 10%. The next day, more seeding flights were made. This time, the silver iodide did not fall into the eye wall, and no reduction in wind speed was observed. These 2 results were interpreted as making the experiment a success. The seedings into Hurricane Esther led to the establishment of Project Stormfury in 1962. Project Stormfury was a joint venture of the United States Department of Commerce and the United States Navy. Do you want to know why some of these people get involved, like GE and the Department of Commerce? Project Baton. The objective of Project Baton, B-A-T-O-N, or Baton, was the analysis of the life history of thunderstorms. A Department of Defense research activity supported by Advanced Research Project Agency. Project Baton sought to expand understanding of storm physics and as an aid to weather forecasting, fire prevention, and possibly for artificially controlling the weather. Dr. Helmut Wickman, as an employee of the United States Army Signal Research and Development Laboratory, and Dr. Paul McCready of Meteorology Research, Inc., were joint leaders of the Project Baton team. During the 1962 July through August storm season in Flagstaff, Arizona, the scientists selected, quote, guinea pig storms and seeded them with chemicals. Effects were thoroughly analyzed from the ground and from the air with time-lapse motion picture cameras, stereo still cameras, storm radar, lightning detectors, and airborne heat sensors. Among the agents inserted in selected clouds were, quote, condensation nuclei, which temporarily increased the number of water droplets in the cloud, and pulverized dry ice, which turns a portion of the cloud into fine snow crystals that remain aloft. The utilization of these agents facilitated studies of a storm's characteristics. Project Stormfury begins. Robert Simpson became its first director, serving in this capacity until 1965. There were several guidelines used in selecting which storms to seed. The hurricane had to have a less than 10% chance of approaching inhabited land within a day. It had to be within the range of a seeding aircraft, and it had to be fairly intense storm with a well-formed eye. The primary effect of these criteria was to make possible seeding targets extremely rare. No suitable storms formed in the 1962 season. Next year, Stormfury began conducting experiments on cumulus clouds. From August 17th through the 20th of that year, experiments were conducted in 11 clouds, of which 6 were seeded and 5 were controls. In 5 of the 6 seeded clouds, changes consistent with the working hypothesis were observed. On August 23rd of 1963, Hurricane Balua, that one, was the site of the next seeding attempt. It had an indistinct eye wall. In addition, mistakes were made as the seedlings of silver iodide were dropped in the wrong places. And as a consequence, nothing happened. The next day, another attempt was made, and the seeders hit their target. The eye wall was observed to fall apart and be replaced by another eye wall with a larger radius. The sustained winds also fell by 20%. All in all, the result of the experiments on Baloo were, quote, encouraging but inconclusive. In the 6 years after Baloo, no seedlings were conducted for several different reasons. In 1964, measurement and observation equipment was not ready to be used. The year after that, all flights were used for additional experimentation on non-hurricane clouds. Joanne Simpson became its director beginning in 1965. While out at 2C in August of the 1965 Atlantic hurricane season, Stormfury meteorologists decided that Hurricane Betsy was a good candidate for seeding. However, the storm immediately swung towards land, and on September 1st, the planned flights were canceled. For some reason, the press was not notified that there were no seedings, and several newspapers reported that it had begun. As Betsy passed close to the Bahamas and smashed into southern Florida, the public and Congress thought that seeding was underway and blamed Stormfury. It took 2 months for Stormfury officials to convince Congress that Betsy was not seeded, and the project was allowed to continue. A second candidate, Hurricane Alina, stayed too far out to see. And after Betsy, 2 other hurricanes came close to being seeded. Hurricane Faith was considered a likely candidate, but it stayed out of range for seeding planes. That same year, recon flights were conducted into Hurricane Inez, but there were no seedings. Both the 1967 and 68 seasons were inactive. Because of that, there was no suitable seeding targets in either of those 2 seasons. Dr. R. Cecil Gentry became the director of Stormfury in 1968. There were no more near seedings until 69. In the interim, equipment was provided. What once was the primitive method of hand dumping dry ice was replaced with rocket canisters loaded with silver iodide, and then gun-like devices mounted on the wings of the airplanes that fired silver iodide into the clouds. Observation equipment was improved. Additional recognizance data was utilized to modify the working hypothesis. The new theory took cumulus towers outside the eye wall into account. According to the revised theory, by seeding the towers, latent heat would be released. This would trigger the start of the new convection, which would then cause a new eye wall. Since the new eye wall was outside the original one, the first eye wall would be choked of energy and fall apart. In addition, since the new eye wall was broader than the old one, the winds would be lower due to the less sharp pressure difference. Hurricane Debby in 1969 provided the best opportunity to test the underpinnings of Project Stormfury. In many ways, it was the perfect storm for seeding. It did not threaten any land. It passed within range of seeding aircraft, and was intense with a distinct eye. On August 18th and again on August 20th, 13 planes flew out to the storm to monitor and seed it. On the first day, wind speeds fell by 31%. On the second day, wind speeds fell by 18%. Both changes were consistent with Stormfury's working hypothesis. Indeed, the results were so encouraging that, quote, a greatly expanded research program was planned. Whoop, whoop. Among other conclusions was the need for frequent seeding at close to hourly intervals. The 1970 and 71 seasons provided no suitable seeding candidates. Despite this, flights were conducted into Hurricane Ginger. Ginger was not a suitable storm for seeding due to its diffusion indistinct nature. The seeding had no effect. Ginger was the last seeding done by Project Stormfury. After the seedings, Atlantic hurricanes meeting all of the criteria were extremely rare, which made duplication of the, quote, success reached by Hurricane Debby extremely difficult. Meanwhile, developments outside of meteorology hindered the cause of hurricane modification. In the early 1970s, the Navy withdrew from the project. Stormfury began to refocus its efforts on understanding rather than modifying tropical cyclones. At the same time, the project's B-17s were nearing the end of their operational lifetimes. At the cost of $30 million, year unknown, 2 Lockheed P-3s were acquired. Due to the rarity of Atlantic hurricanes meeting the safety requirements, plans were moved to move Stormfury to the Pacific and experiment on the large number of typhoons there. This action required many of the same safety requirements as in the Atlantic, but had the advantage of a much higher number of potential subjects. The plan was to begin again in 1976 and seed typhoons by flying out of Guam. However, political issues blocked the plan. The People's Republic of China announced that it would not be happy if a seeded typhoon changed course and made landfall on its shores, while Japan declared itself willing to put up with difficulties caused by typhoons because that country got more than a half of its rainfall from the tropical cyclones. Similar plans to operate Stormfury in the eastern North Pacific or in the Australian region also collapsed. So, failure of the working hypothesis. Multiple eye walls had been detected in very strong hurricanes before, including Typhoon Sarah and Hurricane Donna. Double eye walls were usually only seen in very intense systems. They had also been observed post-seeding in some of the seeded storms. At this time, the only observations of rapid changes in eye wall diameter, other than during presumably successful seedings, occurred during rapid changes in storm intensity. It remained unclear whether the seedings caused by the secondary eye wall or whether it was just part of the natural cycle, because correlation does not imply causation. It was initially thought that eye wall changes similar to those observed in seeded, but not unseeded systems provided the evidence that Project Stormfury was a success. But it was later observed that such eye wall changes were common in unseeded systems as well. Such observations would throw doubt on the hypothesis and assumptions driving Project Stormfury. Data and observations did in fact begin to accumulate that debunked Stormfury's working hypothesis, beginning with Hurricanes Anita and David. Flights by hurricane hunting aircraft encountered events similar to what happened in, quote, successfully seeded storms. Anita itself had a weak example of a concentric eye wall circle, and David a more dramatic one. In August 1980, Hurricane Allen passed through the Atlantic, Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. It also underwent changes in the diameter of its eye and developed multiple eye walls. All this was consistent with the behavior that would have been expected if Allen had been seeded. Thus, what Stormfury thought to have accomplished by seeding was also happening on its own. Other observations and hurricanes Anita, David, Frederick, and Allen also discovered the tropical cyclones have very little supercooled water and a great deal of ice crystals. The reason that tropical cyclones have little supercooled water is that the updrafts within such a system are too weak to prevent water from either falling as rain or freezing. As cloud seeding needed supercooled water to function, the lack of supercooled water meant that seeding would have no effect. Those observations called the basis for Project Stormfury into question. And in the middle of 1983, Stormfury was finally canceled after the hypothesis guiding its efforts was invalidated. The legacy. In the sense of weakening hurricanes to reduce their destructiveness, Project Stormfury was a complete failure because it did not distinguish between natural phenomenon and tropical cyclones and the impact of human intervention. Millions of dollars have been spent, and in the end, Project Stormfury had two fatal flaws. It was neither microphysically nor statistically feasible. In addition, Stormfury had been a primary generator of funding for the Hurricane Research Division. While the project was operational, the HRD's budget had been around $4 million in 1975 US dollars, 16 million 2008 US dollars, with a staff of approximately 100 people. In 2000, the HRD employed 30 people and has a budget of roughly 2.6 million each year. However, Project Stormfury had positive results as well. Knowledge gained during the flights proved invaluable in debunking its hypothesis. Other science resulted in greater understanding of tropical cyclones. And in addition, the Lockheed P3s were perfectly suitable for gathering data on tropical cyclones, allowing improved forecasting of these monstrous storms. Those planes were still used by the NOAA as of 2005. Former Cuban President Fidel Castro alleged that Project Stormfury was an attempt to weaponize hurricanes. So here we've got some Operation Popeye, weather modification in North America, and Alberta hail project. To study hailstorms physics and dynamics in order to design and test means for suppressing hail. It ran from 56 to 1985. The main instruction of this research was the S-band circulary. And we've got some notes there. There's all of our references and so forth and so on. What causes? So it sounds like it was a bit of a fail, although it gave us information. And I'm wondering, what's different today? Is there clearly cloud seeding like motherfuckers out there? So what did they change that made these things work when they weren't necessarily working before? I'd like to know. All right.